Now, the 2017 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings are underway in the Vietnamese city of Da Nang. Every year, members of the world's most dynamic economies and hundreds of CEOs of global companies from across the Asia-Pacific region, they come together. The theme of this year's Apec Summit is creating new dynamism and fostering a shared future. The CEOs' meetings will run till Friday, and the program features interactive discussions, presentations, and a dialogue on a wide range of issues affecting the development of the region. These include innovation and entrepreneurship, a healthy workforce, sustainability, and inclusive growth. Now, the Apec CEO Summit kicked off with a fiery panel discussion of the future of globalization. We caught up with a panelist, Robert Moritz. He's the chairman of the financial services firm PWC, and asked what he thought was the upshot for globalization.
The upshot is I think there's a lot of potential for corporates, potential for countries, and I also think potential for the citizens of those countries to benefit in the upside. But the reality is that it causes us to take action because the old globalization is not what's going to serve us well in the future. And that's where I think the CEO community, the government, and citizens of the world have actually got to redefine what that future looks like. So the hope here is really twofold. One is to make sure that the U.S. is seen as being part of the solution, not part of the problem. I don't know if they'll come back to the drawing board on TPP. I've learned never to predict anything anymore. But I do know that the U.S. knows it needs the countries to be trading with, and those countries need the U.S. just like they need China and other places like it. So it might not be in the form of TPP, but I definitely think you'll have more trade agreements. The trade agreements were built on old school mentality around manufacturing, so re-looking at them makes absolute sense. But doing it in a way that's a hell of a lot more beneficial and mutually beneficial is the goal I think every country and every corporate wants to have right now.
Well, joining us now to discuss key issues surrounding this summit is Ashraf Naguib. He is the Secretary General of the Asia-Egypt Business Association and also the CEO and co-founder of Global Trade Matters. You're very welcome to the show, sir. Now, we know the hot issues at this year's summit: trade agreements, U.S. credibility, as well as China's growing influence, protectionism as well. Now, as a continent, what are the discussions you think we should be watching closely at this year's summit?
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me. What's interesting for us here in Africa, and interesting for us here in Egypt specifically as well, is, and I think around the world, everybody's really watching to see what the United States is going to do. Remember, it's not just it's the first time for Donald Trump to be there, but it's also the first time for about another three great leaders, or three other leaders, or four other leaders like Australia and Japan that have not been there before. So there's a lot of new ideas that are coming to the table. But what is important for us is that there is a push of sustainability for globalization, and that's what we want to see here in Africa, because on our continent we are trying to open up the trade. We're trying to break down the trade barriers. We're trying to have more interconnectivity and connections, which is basically the theme and the basis of the Apec Summit this year. So we are looking to see that, what we're happy to see so far, that there is still a push from the other 20 countries of Apec towards globalization, maintaining the status quo. Now, I do agree, on the other hand, that as the world progresses and things change in a very diverse and volatile global economy, some of these agreements, whether multilateral or bilateral, not just with like the TPP, but for example, here in our side of the world, the GAFTAs and the PAFTAs, even after the Arab Spring, we need to go back and re-revise some of these agreements. And I think Apec also needs to do the same thing at this point. But the push for globalization is what we want to see.
Quite right. And also, certainly the push to boost trade amongst the Asia-Pacific region. But are we seeing as much interest in expanding trade and certainly cooperation with Africa from the rest of the Apec members, as we've seen, of course, from China?
Well, you know, the difficult part here is still Africa is still dealing with its biggest investor, which is China, followed by the United States of America. And they're really doing a lot of things for the African continent, the Chinese. Now, one of the issues that we are really facing here in Africa, and I think the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah Sisi was very, very clear when he was addressing the youth forum that we're holding here in Sharm el-Sheikh, that Africa will not grow and Africa will not become a real global player unless we have the infrastructure that interconnects us as a continent. Until now, we do not have the railway systems, we do not have the highways, and I think that's really where the experience of APEC can come into this, or just the South Asian countries, because China has invested, and we've seen some of the examples in Vietnam as well, in new technologies, in roads, and all of that is part of their push with the One Belt, One Road. So what we're looking at here is more cooperation between China and Africa. We want to see more infrastructure projects. We want connectivity for the continent. And more importantly, APEC is also looking at education. They've got their education cooperation strategy, and we need to enhance education in Africa for us to be able to be more innovative, more competitive, and to be the trade partners that we want to be.
And that leads me to my next question. Tell me a little bit more about what lessons you think Africa can learn from this meeting and what's happened at this year's meeting in terms, of course, of boosting regional trade.
Well, again, you're talking about, 2.8 billion people represented by these 21 countries. You are talking about 59% or 52% of the world GDP, 49% of the total global trade represented in these 21 countries. The reason that they became this strong and they are that powerful is because they built themselves bit by bit by creating the infrastructure that they need, bringing out the trade barriers, moving into the concept of globalization, having the initials or the essentials of cooperation. And these are a lot of the fundamental things that we are still lacking in Africa. But the lesson to be learned here that you will not be able to interconnect your continent until we have that real infrastructure that brings us together and brings us closer and makes the business environment in Africa a little bit easier. And I think the Chinese have been very, very strong in that. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that side of the world at this point.
Well, many thanks for joining us and many thanks for your insights, sir. Of course, that was Ashraf Naguib. He's the Secretary General of the Asia-Egypt Business Association.